And that's why we are here. What I want to do this evening is to try and introduce some meaning into this. The way in which the coronation has been, we were talking about tomatoes earlier on and the processes of propagation. The way the propaganda comes from scattering seeds. The way in which the coronation has been propagated so far seems to me to be extraordinarily misconceived. There's been a drip feed of trivia about this ivory rod and that jewel. Will it be acceptable to the woke crowd or not? That's not what the coronation is about. The coronation is, or should be, two things, and it incorporates two completely different views of what a king is. On the one hand, there's consecration. That's the thing that goes back to to our prehistory, to the very first coronation of which we know anything. It doesn't take place in Westminster Abbey. It takes place in Bath Abbey in 973, and it's for the coronation of King Edgar, the short-lived great-grandson of King Alfred, who is the first real king, not only of all the English, Rex Anglorum, his coins still survive, but also of the whole British Isles. And the coronation, why is it held in Bath? It's held in Bath because Bath is the place that still had, this is only 400 or 500 years after the Romans had left. It's the place that was still the sense of these enormous, vast buildings of imperial Rome. So the coronation was Christian and invoking, of course, before Christ, invoking the world of Judaism, invoking the worlds of the kings of the Jews. When we hear at the moment of anointing, that central moment of the coronation, the bit we won't actually be able to see, the anointing of King Charles, we'll hear Handel's great setting of the verses from the Old Testament, Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anointed Solomon king, and the people, whatever, may the king live forever, and whatever. That extraordinary moment. Well, that is the Christian side, the religious side of the coronation, but also it was invoking the idea of ancient Rome, of the Roman emperors, of that power. Remember, we're a very peculiar civilization. We are consciously in the shadow of a superior civilization, that of Greece and Rome, whose achievements we only matched in the 18th century. I'm going to Rome next week. If you stand in front of the Colosseum, if you stand in the Pantheon, you're in buildings that we could not rival for nearly 1,500 years. Civilizations die. We need to remember we may be at a point of such a death, right? Which is why what the Burkean Society is about, that connection of time past, time present, and time future is so important, and why the coronation, which represents that moment most specifically in the life of the monarchy, is so important. So on the one hand, there's a sense of the king ordained by God, anointed with the holy oils, crowned by bishops, ornamented by prayers and whatever. On the other hand, the coronation, and this is something that really develops after 973, the coronation is about something much more brutal, much more political, much more changeable. The coronation of 973, if you actually look at the text, you look at the anointing, very little has changed. It's quite extraordinary. We're looking at nearly 1,200 years. Very little change. One thing has changed, and changed radically, which is the other side of the coronation, because the coronation isn't just consecration. Otherwise, we would be an absolute monarchy, and we're not. What are we? We're a royal republic. we have all the rights of a republic, but more securely grounded, not in the abstractions of a constitution, but in the pattern of our history. And the pattern of our history is one in which those rights emerge, as such rights always do emerge, by struggle. So the other face of the coronation is the face of contract. The coronation begins with oaths. It begins with the swearing of oaths, which the king is bound to. And also, the course of English history tells you, if the king doesn't obey those oaths, there's a penalty for breach of contract. And it is peculiarly unpleasant. And we will go through a few of the peculiarly unpleasant ways in which that breach of contract has been visited on kings. So we've got then the sense of what we're all familiar with, what King Charles goes on about, what the Queen went on about, that sense of the coronation as a royal dedication to duty. Okay, we're all familiar with that. Again, the processes of anointing, they go right back to, well, we're talking about it to Solomon, even before Solomon, to the first king of the Old Testament. That's 2 generations before Solomon. It's Saul, who is anointed by the prophet Samuel. Then you have David, and then you have Solomon. And the apparatus of the anointing, one tiny bit of it actually survives. Most of the coronation regalia that we will see on May the 6th is a reinvention. Because what you've got to remember is we always beat the French. We beat the French in having a proper revolution and a proper cutting off of the king's head and a proper but decent trial of the king, and also the complete destruction of the royal regalia. That the French preserve, because it's late 18th century, you have a sense of history at that point. So you actually preserve large chunks of the French royal regalia on the grounds of historical significance. A century earlier in England, there was simply the sense that having a king and having symbols of a king was, and they actually use the phrase, it is unnecessary, burdensome, and dangerous. And what you do is you absolutely eliminate every single trace of monarchy. The entire instruments of sovereignty, every one of them was burned or melted down and broken up. And a single thing survives. It is the spoon with which the holy oils were ladled onto the king's head, onto the palms of his hands, onto here, the joints of the arms, onto the breasts, onto the shoulder blades. And the reason why that ceremony is kept veiled is, of course, you can imagine the problems that created with Victoria. The monarch has to be virtually naked for this process. The most surprising bits have to be exposed. And once again, the process of anointing had taken place, the chrism on the head. Chrism, by the way, is a kind of holy brill cream. It's not just oil, it's a compound. It's an emulsion, very sticky emulsion, and it's put on the head and it's put on the hands, and with both of those throughout the Middle Ages, because it was so holy, it was kept on, and you actually had a coif, a linen cap that was put on your head, and gloves that were put on your hands, and the coif was removed several days later in a ceremony. And in the case of Henry IV, the application of these luscious oils on the head led to a terrible outbreak of head lice. So we need to be aware of the physical results of all of this. So there is this, and again, the hands that have been anointed become sacred, they become holy. And right through to the beginning of the 18th century, there was the belief that the royal hands, having been anointed with the holy oils, are capable of actually carrying out miracles. The king becomes a reflection on earth of Christ. And the king was believed to be able to cure people of scrofula, which is called the king's evil. That is to say, it's a disease of it's tuberculosis of the lymph glands of the neck. And it's a jolly good disease to cure because it's liable to spontaneous remission. So, if you do hocus pocus over it, it's pretty likely to go away, but then it will come back again. So the king touches for the king's evil until the beginning of the 18th century. There's also something else which is, in terms of our modern superstitions, have you noticed lots of otherwise quite intelligent people wear bangles claiming they protect them against rheumatism? Well, this actually goes back again to the late Middle Ages, where you had what were called cramp rings. And the ceremony takes place on Maundy Thursday. And again, the way in which all of this is so similar to Christ, the king would lick his fingers, and you would then rub rings of gold en masse, thousands of the things, as particular services chanted over them. And it was then believed if you wore them, it protected you against rheumatism, arthritis, and whatever. So if you see somebody being stupid enough to wear one of these rings on their fingers, tell them they're resorting to late medieval superstition. So there is this very, very powerful sense of the monarch as divinely ordained. Now, if that had continued, we would live in an absolute monarchy, or we'd have long ago abolished it like the French and be contorting ourselves in the horrors that France goes through, having abolished its monarchy. But we did something else, and this is the other face of the coronation, which has just not been explained at all and should be explained. For the kings of England, the peculiar, and remember, the coronation is English. The fact we talk about Britain just confuses the thing. The list of kings is entirely English. It goes back to the Norman conquest. There is no absorption of Scottish ceremony into the coronation at all. You just get a squad of Scots turning up with nothing really to do apart from looking vaguely resentful and remember the fate of Nicola Sturgeon. But maybe think of campervans. But yeah, I know, cheap jokes. I apologize. Cheap jokes are always the best, and they are the easiest to do. But the key thing to understand about the English coronation, it's fundamentally about conditions. So it's a great paradox. You have on the one hand this immense apparatus which signals king by the grace of God, which appears on the coins, Deo gratias and whatever, and Dei gratia, a king by the grace of God, and of course elaborated in the very last moment of our belonging to the Catholic Church by the grant of the title Fidei Defensor, defender of the faith, to Henry VIII. So there's a sense of divine right monarchy on the one hand. But the fundamental of the English coronation is completely different. It is the swearing of oaths, in which the king is accepted as king on condition. It's conditional. And it is in two ways. One of them is very, how shall I say, one of them is simply ceremonial, as the king enters the abbey, and he enters. Remember, Westminster Abbey, the extraordinary thing about Westminster Abbey, it is actually purpose-built for the coronation. The church is created specifically by Henry III for the coronation, and the vast space in front of the coronation screen, in front of the choir screen there, is actually called the theatre. This is a piece of visible designed ceremony, and you lay this extraordinary pavement. This is in the middle of the 1200s. You lay this extraordinary pavement called the Cosmati pavement, which is modelled on the most extravagant things being done in Rome, and the whole space was originally gold mosaic. It would have looked very much like Monreale. Anybody, or indeed, you may be more familiar with the Criterion restaurant in London, which actually echoes the spaces of Monreale. So you have this extraordinary space. But when the king enters the coronation theatre, the first thing that the Archbishop of Canterbury does, and you'll see this at as the procession enters, he turns to the four corners and says, "Will you have this man to be your king?" And then there is this voice that arises from, now of course they've had to bring in girls, originally from the boys of Westminster School, Vivat, Vivat Rex, God save the King, God save the King. This is the Roman acclamation. This is the acclamation of the emperor, or the acclamation of an Anglo-Saxon king. Then there is the peculiar English thing. In all the coronation orders, again going right back to 973, there were three questions. Essentially, will you keep, three O's, will you keep peace between the church and the people? Will you, this is very near the bone, will you repress rapacity and iniquity? Will you, finally, do justice in mercy and in peace? Right, mercy and equity. So those are the three questions. And they become absolutely standard form everywhere in Europe, and nobody takes them seriously, except in England. And in England, we rewrite them. From 1308, this is the accession of Edward II, the son of the great Edward I, the Malleus Scotorum, the hammer of the Scots, the conqueror of Scotland, the reason why the king will be crowned in an extraordinary coronation chair with the stoon of Scone, or is it the Scone of Stoon? I never know. It's a problem when you're talking about scones, isn't it? What are they called? Anyway, the stone of Scone will be under him. Edward II is the complete degenerate son of the great father. He's a bit like me, he's interested in the wrong sex and all sorts of things. Anyway, they knew he was going to be a problem, and what do? They replace the last section of the coronation oath with an extraordinary promise. You will promise to rule according to the laws which shall be chosen, the future perfect, by the community of your realm. You will rule, which that means Parliament is just really getting going. We're 100 years on from Magna Carta, right? Parliament is just really beginning to get going. You promise that you will rule according to the laws which your people choose. You've got a right to assent to them. Remember, the way a Parliament, it's still true. Parliament and all that passes through Parliament, the actual declaratory clause, the clause that gives an act of Parliament its power, is be it therefore enacted by the King's most excellent majesty, with the advice and consent of the Lords spiritual and temporal, and commons in this Parliament assembled that. But it's that sense of the entire community of the realm. And remember, as early as about 40 years after Edward II, judges will deal, taxpayers have always been angsty for very obvious reasons, and people would complain, Parliament's voted a tax on us, and we haven't been in Parliament. And by the time you're in about 1340, the judges have got an absolutely standard answer. Everybody is represented in Parliament, either in person, because they're a bishop or a nobleman, or by their representative, because you voted in the county or in the town for somebody. So that sense of Parliament binding everybody. And that idea, from that point onwards, seems to me to be fundamentally implanted in England. And because Edward breaks it, Edward is dethroned in 1327 and meets a most horrid and unspeakable death, which if anybody here has got a schoolboy imagination, I will describe in detail, but we will perhaps save that for questions afterwards. But again, within the century, that process is repeated. The king of the Middle Ages, with whom I think in many ways we're most familiar, Richard II, the subject of one of Shakespeare's greatest plays, for whom we have two magnificent portraits. There's the great coronation portrait showing him with the orb and the crown against that wonderful gold background, and much more wonderfully, And I was filming there only a few days ago the portrait, the Wilton diptych portrait in the National Gallery, which is completely extraordinary because it shows the king at a moment of time. It shows him on the 6th of January, the feast of the Epiphany. He's born actually on the 6th of January. I suppose a few of us here might even actually know what Epiphany means. It's when Christ is recognized as being immortal and the Son of God by the Gentiles, and the three kings come to adore him. And if you actually look on one leaf of the diptych, you have the Virgin and the child being adored. And then on the other hand, well, you've got three kings. You've got Richard kneeling. You've got behind him St. Edward the Confessor, the founder saint. By the way, that's why Westminster Abbey is there. It's founded by Edward the Confessor, then it's rebuilt by Henry III, specifically as the Coronation Church, with the shrine of Edward the Confessor at its heart. And every king from the Middle Ages to the Revolution of the middle of the 17th century is actually crowned with the regalia of Edward the Confessor. That's why we talk about the Confessor's crown. So there's Edward the Confessor standing behind Richard, holding up the ring, which had been his ring, which is then put on the finger of Richard when he is crowned and anointed. And then next to him, the martyred king of the Anglo-Saxons, St. Edmund, king of the Angles, who, like St. Sebastian, though I think he kept his clothes on, was shot to death with arrows by the Vikings, and because the Vikings didn't believe in half measures, had his head cut off as well. So the martyred king of the East Angles, and then because also the feast of the 6th of January in the Middle Ages is also the feast of the baptism of Christ by John the Baptist. So we have John the Baptist again presenting, with holding the lamb, Richard to the Christ child. Now that's the vision of holy monarchy. That's the vision of the sacredness of monarchy. But when you actually look to the other side of the diptych, it's most beautiful. It's entirely this powerful blue. It's blue bice. It's actually made with lapis lazuli in gum, which is why the colour of that blue thrills at you. It's that extraordinary pigment. And you've got the Virgin and the Child in this extraordinary blue, and then you've got all the heavenly host with their wings and whatever, and it all looks wonderfully holy and beautiful and noble. Then you look a little bit more closely, and they're wearing rather funny things. And then you look at Richard, and you see Richard has got a collar round his neck. You know, the House of Plantagenet, the broom. So he's got a collar of broom cods. He's got a collar of the actual seed pods of the broom that have expanded. And he's got the badge of the White Hart hanging from it. If you actually look across, you'll see the entire heavenly host has been recruited by Richard, because all the angels are wearing broom collars and badges of the White Hart. And this sounds all very beautiful and noble and pretty. Think football hooligans. They are wearing these are retainers. These are people who were there to do the king's dirty work. What Richard is doing is elevating the private power of the monarch as a vast landlord and as a vast retainer of men, and he's using it to manipulate a kind of thuggish, mafia-style monarchy. Of course, there's a very good reason why he does it. He's dealing with the peerage that are mafioso-style people with their own liveries and their own livery collars as well. But a king had to be able to manage that, and what he tries to do instead is simply to dominate it by, to coin a phrase which I'm very fond of, historians call this method of retaining, they call it bastard feudalism. I said what Richard aimed to do was make himself the biggest bastard feudal lord of them all. And it fails horribly, and he too falls in 1399. He is condemned in the Great Hall, Westminster Great Hall, that he is rebuilding as this magnificent shrine of monarchy, and the principal charge against him, as it had been against Edward II, is breaking his coronation oath. He said that the laws were in his mouth, and they're not. They're in acts of Parliament. And surprisingly, all of that survives. You all know I'm interested in Henry VIII. The astonishing thing is Henry VIII gets away with it. Henry VIII breaks those other sections of the coronation oath. He breaks the oath to keep peace between church and people. He breaks his oaths to the Pope. How does he get away with it? Because he keeps his oath to Parliament. The whole of that vast break with Rome is carried out through Parliament and with Parliament's consent. Because what again we've got to remember, the key to understanding the English monarchy and the miracle of the English monarchy is you keep a representative assembly going because it's useful. This is the disaster of the Supreme Court's judgment on Boris. If you remember, the Supreme Court said that the purpose of Parliament is to oppose. The purpose of Parliament is to hold the monarch is to hold the government to account. It's not. Our government is based in Parliament. Our government controls Parliament. Parliaments are useless unless they're managed. And Henry is the pioneer manager. His great ministers, Wolsey, not so much Wolsey, but Cromwell, are the pioneer managers of Parliament. So Henry gets away with his extraordinary changes because he's able to carry Parliament with him. And if you look at things like the confiscation of the monasteries, many of you here are prosperous people who live in houses that were stolen from the monasteries. You may well inherit your land from the stealing from the monasteries. And the reason that it's done is that the only people who suffered were the monks. Every other contract they'd entered into, every other payment that they'd engaged for was honoured. And if the monks went along with it, they were paid big pensions as well. It's done as a straightforward property deal. And many of you here are in property and understand exactly what was going on. Right, so the great break then in our history comes with the succession of the alien House of Stuart, and the Scottish succession at the beginning of the 17th century. And it's very important we understand how this happens. It happens in defiance of the will of Henry VIII. Henry VIII had deliberately left the crown away from Scotland. Elizabeth does not like this idea, so we have a very, very English solution to the problem. Henry left a will, which was endorsed by Act of Parliament, which said, under no circumstances is Mary Queen of Scots or the future James I entitled to inherit the English throne. How do they deal with it? They look at it very solemnly in 1566. They say this is very, very difficult. They order a very large chest with 2 locks. They put the will in the chest with 2 locks. And it seems to me it's at this point that the king is able to have this bizarre idea that he wields power by divine right rather than by that contract that I've been talking about. So you then get this dreadful conflict of the 17th century. There's something else that's worth putting into that conflict, which is that Henry VIII, again, we know were ruled from Whitehall. What is Whitehall? Whitehall is the palace of Henry VIII. We also know that Parliament meets in the Palace of Westminster. The beginning of Henry VIII's reign sees this extraordinary process in which the Palace of Westminster, the public bit, where Parliament meets, where the law courts meet, where the Exchequer meets, that's preserved. But the private bit of the palace burns down. The king goes and lives for 20-odd years at Greenwich, and he commutes by boat, very sensible, when he has to be in London. And it's only when Cardinal Wolsey falls and York Place, the great house of the Archbishops of Canterbury, the Archbishops of York, on the site of the present Ministry of Defence, is confiscated, and Henry rebuilds it as this vast new Palace of Whitehall. And from that point onwards, we have been ruled by this tension between Whitehall and Westminster. And Whitehall and Westminster seem to me to be, again, one of the things that lies at the back of the coronation and lies at the back, too, of what's going wrong now. Because the way in which you were able to we had a civil war, which was, again, fought over this issue of who controls, finally, law. And, as I said, The monarchy was abolished in 1649. It was declared to be dangerous, unreasonable, and all the rest of it. And the reason is, it's not that there were any real republicans in 1649. There were instead two completely different views of monarchy. There was the view of the monarch as representing the proper way of doing things. That's the monarchy of the Palace of Westminster. And there's the other view of monarchy, which is the actual direct, personal, private will of the monarch, as incorporated in the Privy Council, incorporated in the Secretaries of State, and cited in the Palace of Whitehall. And it's the conflict between those two things that leads to the Civil War. And so how finally is it reconciled? Why do we still have a monarchy? Why is monarchy brought back? Why is there still a coronation? Well, the answer is we decided we couldn't do without a king. We tried doing without a king under Cromwell, and we discovered that what you get is an absolutist dictatorship, and that what monarchy represents is power that is controlled. You then bring back, in an extraordinary way, we are the only country ever completely to have reversed a revolution by itself. Eastern Europe reversed revolutions that were imposed on it by Russia. We reversed a revolution ourselves as a matter of choice. This seems to me to be an absolute and fundamental point. But the question is, having done that, how do you make the system work? How do you cope with the fact you may have a Richard II, you may have an Edward II, you may have a James II, you may indeed have a Charles III. How do you make it work? Well, the answer is, you create the office of Prime Minister. And what the office of Prime Minister is, he's a Janus figure. He's designed to do two completely different but complementary things. On the one hand, he controls the monarch on behalf of Parliament. And on the other hand, he controls Parliament on behalf of the monarch. And all of that is summated in the Glorious Revolution of 1689, when that clause that I mentioned, that one at the beginning of 1308, that the monarch shall rule in accordance with the laws and customs which shall be chosen by the community of the realm. It's rewritten quite simply. It says, the monarch shall rule in accordance with statutes made in Parliament. And that's the key thing. And what I regret to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, is since 1931, no monarch has actually sworn that oath because they were seduced with the idea of empire and commonwealth. There we are.